Tonight's speaker is the Henry Gardner Simmons Professor of Management at Rice University. He's the author of the new book, Stretch, which examines why some people and organizations succeed with so little, while others fail with so much. With his research in psychology and management, he provides an innovative approach to succeeding in business and life using the science of resourcefulness. His award-winning research, teaching, and consulting has helped Fortune 500 executives, entrepreneurs, and professionals in industries such as technology, healthcare, retail, education, banking, manufacturing, and nonprofits. Please join me in welcoming Scott Sonenshein.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you tonight about some highlights from my book, Stretch, and I thought I would go back in time about 16 or 17 years ago. I was just finishing my studies, and I was in my first job working in Washington, D.C. And it was okay. I mean, it was a consulting job. It was pretty humdrum. And so I was delightfully surprised when I received a phone call out of the blue about a year into my position from a recruiter in Silicon Valley. I didn't know much about Silicon Valley. I'd never stepped foot in California, let alone the area. And she had what seemed like an unbelievable pitch for me. She said, "Everyone is coming out to Silicon Valley right now. You should get here. Every week we've got a new company that's doing an initial public offering. People are making lots of money. There's lots of parties. It's very exciting." This sounded intriguing to me, and I decided I would go visit, and about 3 weeks later I ended up moving. And I got out there, and it was even crazier than I would have anticipated. Because the way that we thought about success and what was happening was all about the quantity of resources out there. It was what companies can raise the most money. How many new employees can you bring in each week? How many new customers can you bring in even if they weren't necessarily making money? There were lots of launch parties, lots of lavish perks. And I found this a little confusing as I started to dig in. I started asking some questions. So this business is based off of spending a lot on advertising to drive customers to a website where every dollar that they spend, we lose 25 cents. What is this model out here? Well, what was happening is something that I call chasing. And this is the antithesis of what I write in the book about stretching. Chasing is the idea that the more resources we have, the better results that we can achieve. And for organizations out there and for individuals who were also looking to make it big, the entire philosophy was, how can we suck up as many resources as quickly as possible? And you heard things like, we've got to grow there, we've got to grow faster than anyone, we've got to get there sooner. So there was this big push to make both organizations as well as the people working there buy into this narrative, buy into this story that it was about acquiring things as fast as we can. Now, as you know, things didn't go according to plan, and the stock market crashed, venture capital dried up, people didn't want to fund these companies, and they were exposed for what they were, which was namely unsustainable businesses with people who had unsustainable careers in them. Roughly 50% of companies founded during this era ended up going kaput several years after the dot-com bust. And of course, at the time, there were also some very significant events happening around the country. In the middle of my time in Silicon Valley, September 11th happened. And this was an awakening call for many people to reflect on what it was that was most important for them. Unfortunately, I was personally touched by this tragedy as well, as one of my colleagues at my company was Jeremy Glick, who of course some of you might remember as the hero or one of the heroes from Flight 93. As I was reflecting on what was happening around the country and thinking about what had brought me down to Silicon Valley, I started this realization that maybe I wasn't doing what I should be doing. And I ended up going to graduate school and starting a research journey that's lasted now about 15 years that helps bring to you some of the ideas I want to share with you this evening. And those ideas start with the idea of stretching. But before I get there, let me try and help you visualize why chasing is so pervasive even today, because history repeats itself over and over again. And it was the Silicon Valley boom and bust. We've had the housing crash. History keeps repeating itself. And a large part of that is through what we call mindless accumulation. How we start chasing because we lose sight of what our true and meaningful goals are. Just like when I was in Silicon Valley, I lost track of what my meaningful goals are. Let me share with you what research has to say about how we lose track of our goals. And I want to do so by talking about one of my favorite topics, chocolate. You guys have some really good chocolate, by the way, in Louisville. I got a little sample of it today. Okay, so in one study, what happened is researchers gave participants the opportunity to earn some chocolate, but they had to work. And they broke the group into two sections based off of random assignments. So some are going to go in one section, some are going to go in the other section. One section, let's call them the high earners. Those were the fortunate people. They did not have to work a lot to get a lot of chocolate. Then there were the low earners. They had to work 10 times as much to get that same amount of chocolate. What the participants were told is, you'll get the chance to earn chocolate, and then after that, you're going to get the chance to enjoy that chocolate. Whatever chocolate you earned, you're going to eat afterwards, but you can't take any of it home. Just earn what you can eat. So how do we work? Well, in this research, the participants were listening to the nice sound of relaxing music, and then they had to get up, press a button, and that nice sound of music was interrupted by the annoying sound of a saw cutting wood. And they had to press this button 100 times in the low earning condition and 10 times in the high earning condition. Now, what happened in both groups, of course, is that they over-earned the amount of chocolate than they could eat. They ended up working much harder than they needed to get chocolate because they couldn't physically eat any more chocolate. So they had overworked. Okay, so the next question is, well, why would they overwork knowing that they had to eat the chocolate? Well, they had mindlessly just thought, well, I just want to try and get as much as I can without actually reflecting about their true goal, which was not to get as much chocolate, but to get as much chocolate as they can enjoy. So how do we turn this off? Well, one way we can do is what the researchers did, which is they told some participants in a follow-up study, here's a cap. We're going to tell you you can only earn so much chocolate. And once you work past this, we're not going to give you any more chocolate. So of course, people started adjusting and they were more mindful of their goals and they didn't over-earn that chocolate. But here's the most interesting part of the study to me. Both while they were earning the chocolate and while they were eating the chocolate, the people who were in that cap condition, the people who actually earned less chocolate, were happier. They were happier working and they were happier eating the chocolate. And the reason is quite simple. They were pursuing goals that they care about. But too often when we chase, we end up pursuing goals that we don't care about because our real goals get replaced by just trying to accumulate more and more things, whether they be in our workplaces or in our home places. And so stretching is about how can we find a way of working and living that gets away from chasing. And it starts with a simple but really powerful shift in thinking. That the better use of resources equals better results. It's not what we have, it's how we use what we have. Now, when we think of stretching, our intuitions might be that this is something we do when we're falling on hard times. Right? We know that necessity is the mother of all invention, and people who might be of lesser means or unlucky or in some other unfortunate circumstance likely know stretching as a way of life, a way of survival. And indeed, in my research, I've learned a lot from people in these types of situations. They are remarkably creative in how they go about trying to get by. And there's a lot we can learn. But my challenge to you tonight, for those of you who find yourselves in more fortunate circumstances where stretching is not a need, but it's actually a choice, is to ask yourself whether you have the courage to recognize that we often have more than we realize to achieve our goals, whether or not you have the wherewithal to appreciate that we often have abundance right in front of us if we can only think about our resources like time, money, connections, and relationships in different ways. And indeed, when we think about what's around us, Even if we find ourselves in situations of relative abundance, like most of us in this country, thinking about scarcity actually can make us more creative and innovative. So in one study, researchers divided groups into two, again based off of random groups, and they said one group, think about a time when you were a child when you had a lot of things. We'll call that the abundance group. Another group was told to think about a time when they didn't have a lot of things. That's the scarcity group. And then they were told to solve a practical problem that a university had some extra bubble wrap. What should they do with it? And it turns out that simply thinking about scarcity, regardless of the objective situations people were in, led to more creative and innovative ideas. And there's a simple reason for this. When we think about abundance, we tend to use the resources we need to accomplish our goals in traditional ways, like anyone else would use those resources. But when we think about scarcity, we give ourselves a license. We give ourselves that permission to do things differently. And as a result, we often come up with better ideas. So to contrast stretching and chasing starts with how we fundamentally think differently about our resources. When we're stretching, we think any resource is changeable. You want to get a picture hung in your house and you don't have a hammer handy, you don't think twice. You go for your shoe and you get the job done right away. When chasing, you feel you need that hammer. And if you don't have that hammer handy, you're going to go look in your garage. And if it takes you half an hour to find that hammer, you're going to go find that hammer. And if you don't have it, you're going right to the hardware store. Or you're waiting until the next day when maybe your spouse comes back and he or she tells you where that hammer is. Because when we're chasing, we often wait to pursue our goals. We have the thought that, well, if I had more time or more money or more information or more connections or a hammer, I'd be able to get done what I want to get done. With stretching, we see resources as changeable and we get the job done right away. Our actions when stretching are about how do we expand what we have? How do we take resources that traditionally get used in one way and use them in a very different way? Whereas with chasing, it's all about acquiring. We build our organizations, we build our lives around trying to get much because we have this belief that our achievements are dependent on having more. With stretching, we're focused on what our true goals are. And for most people, I venture to say our goals are not to get more stuff. We want to use that stuff to actually accomplish something in this world. But with chasing, that's hard to do because one of the engines of chasing are what psychologists call social comparisons. We look at our neighbors, we look at our colleagues, we look at our friends, and we feel we need those same tools, those same resources in order to be successful. And when we get those same tools and those same resources, we elevate our comparisons to those who have even more. So it's a never-ending rat race of always needing more to do more. So what I want to convince you is that there's actually great power of less. And if we can get into this mindset, we can begin to see situations where less can be turned into a lot more. And I'm going to share with you 5 different ways in which the idea of stretching can apply in different aspects of our work and our lives. The first is what I call ownership. And I want to take you to some research I've done in a retail setting. And when you hear the word ownership, you usually wouldn't think of people who work in retail settings who often barely make above minimum wage. Well, I was studying a chain of women's fashion boutiques, and I went to the most successful store manager in the chain. And I wanted to know, what is it that makes you so successful at your work? And he told me a story. He told me a time that he received a dress that, quite frankly, he considered a piece of junk. In fact, it was so cheaply made it wouldn't even stay on the hangers. He had lots of these dresses, customers weren't buying them. In most situations, I think a lot of retail employees would say, that's not my problem. I've been given a bad set of products and they're not selling, and I'm just going to wait until I get something better to sell. Well, what this person did was quite different. What he did is he took the dress and then he took a pair of scissors and he cut the straps off. Then he rolled up the dress, wrapped a bow around it, and made a sign. And the sign said, Beach Cover-Up. It went from last seller to bestseller. And soon every store in the chain's 500 stores, were implementing this idea. In a lot of organizations, quite frankly, that would have gotten you fired, right? It's called damaging the product. Because we don't instill ownership in people. And what research shows is, ironically, when you don't have a lot of resources around, it makes you more connected to what you do have. And you have this feeling of ownership, that these are your resources, this is your store, and these are your problems to solve. And we empower employees then on the front line to be able to solve problems and make responsible decisions. 2, outsiders solve problems. This is in contrast to experts. In our society, we tend to hold experts in high esteem. And there's good reason for experts. If I have someone who comes to office hours at my university and they say, Dr. Sonenshein, I'm not feeling well, I'll tell them to go see a real doctor because I can't really help them. So there's a reason for experts. But in many respects, experts don't have the best answers, even though we think they do. Now in this book, Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell popularized research done by the psychologist Anders Ericsson on what's called, or popularly been known as, the 10,000-hour rule. That you need 10,000 hours of something to develop proficient expertise to be really good at it. I'm looking at a slightly different question here, which is when you have non-routine, complex problems, the experts always have the best answer. And it turns out that having that type of experience isn't always helpful, and in some contexts, it actually can be a liability. So in one study, and this is a study of multiple studies, over 100 studies, 11,000 data points, researchers set out to answer a very simple question. How much does practice explain performance? Well, in games like chess, that number is 26%. And as far as social science findings and effects go, this isn't too bad of a number, although my guess is this is probably a lot lower than you would have guessed. In music, that number is 21%. In sports, it's 18%. This next one gives me a lot of pause as a teacher, but in education, it's 4%. And in professional work, it's less than 1%. And there's a clear pattern going through this data, of course. As we go from very structured, routine contexts where the rules are known and always the same, and chess is the perfect example of that, to less structured, frequently changing activities where the rules are always changing, and in many respects, those rules are unknown, the effect of expertise on performance almost disappears. And in fact, in another study, this one looked at 166 scientific labs across 10 different countries. And the question was really simple and should have been straightforward. How much scientific knowledge in a domain does a scientist have? How does that explain how well they can solve a problem in that same domain? Well, it turns out there is a relationship. The more scientific knowledge a scientist has in the domain, the less likely they were to solve that complex problem. The less likely. Exactly the opposite. And the question is why? Experts develop very specific ways of seeing problems. They bring tools and resources to problems in ways that they're trained to. But as the rules are changing and you face complexity and uncertainty, and I'd argue that we're in one of the most uncertain times right now in this country than we've ever been before, that expertise can become a liability as they become entrenched in seeing things through very specific ways of training. 3, competition is your friend. Now, one of the principles of stretching is this idea of unthinkable combinations. How do you combine things that you think would never be combinable? And one of the things I came across in my own research was combining competition and friendship. I had the privilege of spending 3 years doing field research of gourmet food trucks. And it was tasty. It was slightly hazardous to my health. I gained 15 pounds during this research that I worked really hard to lose. But I learned something really interesting. Well, first of all, it's harder talking to a food truck owner than it is talking to a Fortune 500 executive because they're so busy and they don't have phones really and they never answer email. So what you have to do is you have to go taste their food and get to know them. And I tasted a lot of food in this study. And when you think about food trucks, for those of you not familiar with them, these are some of the most resource-constrained businesses you can imagine. They work in metal tin boxes, and in the summertime, at least in the market I studied, it can be 130 degrees. They're standing on their feet all day, working 18-hour shifts with inferior equipment. They often have less training than brick-and-mortar restaurants. and they have very little brand awareness when they start. Yet they produce so much: innovative cuisine, tasty food, meaningful work for employees, satisfaction for owners, and even profits. And my question in this research is how? How can an industry full of organizations that have so little end up producing so much? Well, it all came down to this, which is really counterintuitive for someone who spends most of his days teaching MBA students. Competitors can actually be really good friends. So you're a pizza truck and you run out of mozzarella cheese. You can't get it because you're in the middle of your shift. One of your food truck friends will bring you that mozzarella cheese. Your truck breaks down. One of your food truck friends will fix that truck. You had a bad week. You didn't get a lot of business for lunch. Several trucks will funnel business your way the next week. You're selling cupcakes. The truck next to you is selling cupcakes. You run out of cupcake wrappers. What do? You go next door and say, "Hey friend, you have some extra cupcake wrappers." No problem. There were these remarkable instances of organizations that you think would be trying to compete fiercely for scarce resources, given how constrained their industry was, cooperating in the most unbelievable ways. And when they cooperated, they elevated the stakes and the prospects of everyone in that industry. And there's, of course, other types of unthinkable combinations that we make. Lots of innovation comes from unthinkable combinations. This is the 10-year anniversary of the iPhone. Before then, you had a camera and you had a phone. Now you have a device that changes not only the way I spend most of my days, but also my children. 4, we live up or down to expectations. And I thought I would start this off by telling you about a really remarkable horse named Hans. And in the 1890s, Hans was wowing crowds throughout Europe because it turns out that Hans was able to do math. You ask Hans what 4 plus 7 is, he'd tap his hoof 11 times. You ask him what 10 divided by 3 is, he'd tap his hoof 3 times, and then of course he'd add a 4th for the remainder. No one would believe that this horse had the cognitive skills to do math. So much so that an entire investigation unfolded. It was called the Hans Commission, and it was composed of so-called experts in zoology and animal behavior and a whole spectrum of people. They said, okay, let's try this. Let's take the master out of the picture who's been training Hans for years, and then let's ask Hans some questions. Same thing. Hans was still able to do his math problems. So the commission concluded Hans really is one clever animal. Well, another 2 years would go by, and a jointly trained psychologist and biologist would finally unravel the mystery of Hans. It actually turned out he really couldn't do math. But what he could do was quite remarkable. He was able to read expectations. He was looking at the body language of his master or whoever was asking the questions and was able to know when to stop tapping his hoof. And in fact, it turned out that Hans was able to use this not just for math, but we're in the library right now. It actually turned out he was able to read too. Well, it turns out that humans are also strong signalers of expectations. Oftentimes, this is done explicitly with the spoken words. Sometimes this is done more implicitly through our body language, assignments we might give to people at work, or how we interact with people. We might hear about a jerk of a new colleague or a new neighbor that's not nice before we've even had the chance to meet him or her. Well, how are we going to react when we meet him or her? We're going to treat those people like they are jerks. And we create what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy. We interact with them in ways that turn them into that jerk. Because the problem is, in so much of what we do, we put the proverbial dunce cap on people. Now, the dunce cap was one of the worst inventions ever, right? This is what was widely used in schools, and the idea was children were misbehaving in schools because they wanted to act up, and if you could only shame them, then you would change their behavior. Well, what happened? You set low expectations for people, and they live up to those expectations. So the dunce cap had the exact opposite effect. The challenge that we have as people, however, is when we end up doing something bad ourselves or having an outcome that looks bad, we have access to our situation. We understand why something might have happened. We show up late to work, for example. We know we were stuck in a traffic jam. Or we slip in the hallway. We see there was a puddle in the hallway, and that's what made us slip. But when we observe other people's behavior, we don't have access to their situations. So someone who's late to work, they're irresponsible. Someone who slips in the hallway, they're clumsy. So what we tend to do is we expect the worst out of people because we don't have access to their situations. But what happens if we replace the dunce cap with a competence cap? If instead of expecting the worst, we expect the best in people? What research shows is we can do everything from make children smarter to make employees more productive if we set positive expectations for people. We create positive prophecies, not put that dunce cap on people. As long as we do one thing, we have to set expectations that are not just positive, but that are credible and believable. Because if they're not, those positive expectations turn into performance pressure. 5, success comes from doing, not planning. I think we often trick ourselves into believing that we get rewarded and we achieve good results based off of what we plan to do. But that's, of course, not true at all. It's based off of what we actually do. The challenge is we think that if we spend a lot of time planning, we can cope with uncertainty. But the reality is we live in uncertain times, and forget about trying to plan 5 years. It's really hard to plan a year or even a month sometimes. And in fact, what research shows where stakes are highest, think about organizations that are making multi-billion-dollar bets with their capital. The relationship between strategic planning and performance is almost zero. And I'd say the same thing applies in our everyday lives, that we try and script out everything from every minute our children should spend to what we want to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important to have goals, but it's also important to be able to learn how to improvise, because what research shows is if we can get better at experimenting and trying new things, instead of trying to make grand plans in the future, but process real-time information from little experiments where we just try some things, we learn how those go, and then we recalibrate, we can be more successful. And I'll give you a really simple example of how this gets manifested. And this example is from work, but I'll tell you this will also be true for when you're having family discussions. Now think about how most meetings unfold. Sometimes you might be assigned a seat, or sometimes the seating will be completely random. And what happens is, at lots of meetings, people don't listen. And I want to explain to you how I came to this realization and then the research behind it. The very first class I taught, it was at the University of Michigan. I was doing my PhD there, and there was a bunch of undergraduate students. And it turns out that if you put participation in the syllabus, everyone all of a sudden wants to participate. So I had a whole sea of hands wanting to say something and get airtime. So I said, okay, this sounds like a reasonable way to deal with this problem. I'm going to say you're going to talk, then you're going to talk, then you're going to talk, then you're going to talk, and you're going to talk, and so on. And I'd go around the room just like I did, and I'd set a speaking order. And what would inevitably happen is I get to maybe the 4th or 5th student, and that person, with the confidence and, dare I say, slight arrogance of an undergraduate student at a top institution, would say what they thought was the most profound comment. And they had a big smile on their face. And in reality, it was a pretty good comment, but the problem was everyone else in the room was cringing, and the student couldn't figure out why. Why is everyone looking at me funny? Didn't I say something really clever? Well, what had happened is the student had almost verbatim repeated what the person right next to them had just said. And the reason for this is what social psychologists call the next in line effect. Our minds literally shut down 9 seconds before we think it's our turn to speak, and remain shut down as much as 9 seconds after we've just spoken. Those first 9 seconds are all dedicated to planning. What am I going to say that's going to make a really clever comment? How am I really going to advance this conversation? How am I going to win this argument with my spouse? And afterwards, we're evaluating how those comments went. Did that comment earn me extra participation points? Did I really win this argument with my spouse or my child? This is one of the perils of planning. When we're planning, we lose sight of all of what's unfolding in the present right in front of us. And what I encourage you to do is to get more comfortable experiencing that present as opposed to simply just planning for tomorrow. Because when we experience the present, there's a lot of rich information that we can use to shape what that tomorrow looks like. And I thought I would leave you with one way of, I think really captures this orientation that we don't need to wait for tomorrow or plan to tomorrow to get to our goals. We can start reaching our goals right now and today with what we have. And it starts with this gentleman right here, and I'm guessing no one in the room has an idea who this is. I'd be very impressed. I've given this talk several times before, and don't worry, no one has figured out who this is. You might know his name, and I can tell you for sure you're familiar with his work. This is Dan Wieden. He's an advertising executive. And like a good stretching organization, several decades ago, he was in his makeshift office because he couldn't afford prime space. He was in the basement of a dingy building. This is an era before cell phones. He couldn't afford an office phone, so the payphone was his office phone. And he had a problem on his hands. He had a pressing deadline, and one of his upstart clients needed an advertising slogan to be able to unify its different TV campaigns, and TV and print campaigns. And it was with that back against the wall in that constrained environment that he made the most bizarre connection. He remembered roughly a decade before a gentleman by the name of Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore, to say the least, was a terrible person. He was a lifelong criminal, and he had committed what would turn out to be the last of his most heinous crimes. He had brutally murdered 2 people. As Dan Wieden reflected on all of this destruction, he remembered that unlike most people on death row, Gary Gilmore desperately wanted to die. In fact, his mother wrote a letter to the governor asking for clemency, and Gary Gilmore told his mother to be quiet and let him die. And other religious organizations and the ACLU were also rebuffed in their petitions. Gary Gilmore finally got his wish, and the last words that he uttered in the death chamber were this: "Let's do it." That gave Dan Wieden enough inspiration to finish his job. And he created what are arguably the 3 most valuable words put together in American language. Because this advertising slogan, of course, not only ended up launching the Nike brand, but it also changed our culture. And I like this story because I think it summarizes 3 points I want to leave with you today. The first is, think about the context in which Dan Wieden created this slogan. He was in a constrained environment, under a tight deadline, in a makeshift office without proper equipment. And it put him into that mindset to stretch. Second, think about the words he repurposed. They were the ultimate epitome of death and destruction. I mean, in fairness, I'll tell you, you will not find this story on the Nike website, by the way. But he took what was so tragic and terrible and turned it into something so valuable. And third, the expression itself. It's a call to action. It's a recognition that we don't need to wait for tomorrow. We don't need to wait for more time or more money or more connections or a bigger job or a better office. The time is today to start working with what we have and make the most out of it to achieve our goals. The time is today to break our dependence on the belief that if we had more, we can do more. The time is today to recognize that more actually is more of a myth, and there's great power in less. The time right now is to start stretching, and I invite you to do so. Thank you very much. Yes? Oh, would you mind going to the microphone though, please?
The size of your sample is large, but the subject is, most of this applies more to individuals than corporations, question mark?
Oh, sure. It's a great question. And the book is full of examples and research at the organizational level as well. And in fact, what happens is I profile people who have built very successful businesses based off of stretching. And they come to this sometimes as a personal belief because they're raised in circumstances that stretching becomes a necessity and a way of life. And they take those beliefs and they instill a culture of organization. So the very opening story of the book is called A Tale of Two Beers, and I profile two different beer companies. One is a large company at the time called Stroh's, which was based in Detroit, Michigan, and they took a chasing mentality. They tried to acquire lots of different brewers and ended up going bankrupt. While they were going bankrupt, another company, D.G. Yingling and Sons, were able to buy their assets on the cheap. And Dick Yingling, who was one of Forbes' 500 richest people in America, built his entire business. He inherited what was a struggling family business, and he turned it into a very large and successful beer company by slowly growing, embracing constraints, not spending money on marketing, not trying to chase after the same things that most other people were in the industry, and he built himself quite a successful business. And I can go through lots of other examples, but if you have a specific question about how this applies to organizations, I'm also happy to answer that too.
My first job was in aerospace, surface-to-air missiles. It was a division of Eaton. Eaton, who specialized in making widgets, had no idea how to run an aerospace division. But the vice president of the division plowed 12% of the profits back into R&D, because otherwise you wouldn't have anything for the next DoD's request for bid in the future. And Wall Street takes a very short-sighted view. I would hope that someday we adopt Europeans' reporting requirements so that we're more annual than quarterly, so that corporations as a whole and the people who invest take a more far-sighted view. And my last question was, what do you think of GE and Six Sigma? Because prior planning prevents piss-poor performance.
Yeah, no, a lot of great questions there. And what you often see with organizations, of course, is they start off very resourceful and they're very scrappy. I spend a lot of time in tech, both professionally and in terms of my research. And what happens when they grow is they then want the facade that looks like they're really successful. So they build a really fancy building and they invest in lots of things that end up not helping the business model, and they lose sight of that culture that creates resourcefulness. And I agree with you, a lot of this is driven by investors. In the venture capitalist case, you get money, you got to spend that money so you can get more money, and every time you get more money, magically the value of your company grows. Until, of course, someone stops writing the check, and investors lose patience. And that's one of the dangers of this model of chasing.
In software, you do state tables before you program. If you do a level 3 or a level 6 version of developing software, you start, it can be an outsider, but you start with a business model. You break it down into what are the critical paths and the rules. You build the state table, and then you figure out what's the critical path and how to reinvent the organization. There's a lot of planning in there, even if they're not expert.
Yeah. Let me briefly touch upon that and then give someone else a chance to ask questions. But if you think about even new models in software planning, like the Scrum model, that model itself is basically rejecting the traditional model of software development and moving to shorter and shorter cycles that look a lot more like the improvisational model I talk about in Stretch. So a good recommendation for you, if from the software side, would be to pick up the book by Sutherland and Sutherland called Scrum. I think you'd see a very different model of what software development looks like today than it might have even a decade ago. Yes, sir.
Yes, my late wife, who died a couple of years ago, many years ago, began to disdain the description of anybody as an expert. And on the news channels or the financial channels, you're always seeing experts being interviewed to predict the future, and most of them are wrong usually. Obviously, once in a while they're right because they're always called back, but they're paid a lot of money. And your comments on experts were very interesting to me. Can you expand on that a little bit? You specifically said that strategic planning and outcome have basically a zero relationship in success, I guess, if I'm phrasing that correctly. So if you could expand on that. Obviously you've studied the idea of what an expert is and what that means, and you had a very interesting graph about the chess player. That's a routine.
Right.
You become very good at it, but then not very good at other things.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, I was, when I first came across the study I put up there with the chess and all the way down to the professional work, I was really shocked. I mean, I wasn't shocked that the trend showed that as you went from less structured activities, the effect of expertise was less. I was shocked at the magnitude of the size and how small some of those effects were. I mean, if you think about how we view experts, I mean, it's shocking that so much of performance is not actually explained by that practice. And I had a nice long chat with one of the authors of that paper about it because I was really fascinated with it. Now, what's interesting is those type of experts are a little different than the ones you talk about on TV, although there's good research to also prove your point there. The experts on TV might not have achieved that amount of practice that I'm talking about. When I talk about experts, I'm talking about people who accumulate a level of practice. Unfortunately, sometimes the people on TV are just there for a variety of reasons, even if they don't have credentials. But there's been research, namely by Phil Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania, who has studied those TV experts. And he finds something very similar to what I reported in the research on practice, which is those experts fare worse than, in most cases, random predictions, and that there are some people who are just lay people who he essentially defines as people who are really adept at reading the news and spend a lot of time immersed reading the news who actually make better predictions. So I'm sorry about your wife, but I think she was onto something.
I think she was too. Thank you.
Hello. As an author writing about ingenuity and stretching your resources, did you have any opposition in writing the book from like competitors promoting the opposite?
Well, there's always going to be people who promote the opposite ideas, but I think that the science, I make a pretty strong scientific case. If you see the back of the book, there's, I don't know, maybe 30 pages of footnotes documenting every single scientific claim that I make. So I think the book is compelling, but of course there's always going to be people who look at the other side of this. And you know, the expertise debate is a big debate right now in the social sciences, and you know, I think Malcolm Gladwell started off that conversation by popularizing some research, but I think the pendulum is swinging the other way. But that's how science advances. I mean, if no one disagreed with me or anyone else, it'd be really uninteresting. We'd just be talking to ourselves, basically. So I welcome that criticism, and I welcome that discussion. And if you've got any, share it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Since we're talking about some other views, there was a book by Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir about scarcity, where they found that usually when you experience scarcity, you kind of tunnel vision on one thing, and you find maybe less ingenuity, and you might sacrifice long-term results to fill your current needs. Do you think that that might be a relation to the amount of scarcity you're experiencing, where the more extreme scarcity might produce that tunnel vision, or is it maybe an individual mindset that might make the difference?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you know what I'm advocating for, and what the research shows, is that you can't completely starve people from resources. In fact, a lot of the research has what we would call a curvilinear relationship. So you imagine kind of an inverted U, where having too little resources, where you starve an organization, is just as harmful as having too many. On the too few, you don't have enough to invest in your business. On the too many, you have so much that you end up squandering and wasting and don't get into this mindset. So that would be my intuition, is that a lot of this comes down to the extremeness. And when you're in, you know, conditions where you have almost nothing, then that might put you into a different type of mindset where you feel that your very survival is at stake. But for moderate levels of scarcity, I think that the science would support the claims that I'm making today.
So there's kind of a sweet spot in there of where you want to be, not too much, but enough.
Right, you got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kind of touching onto that same idea, what do you do when you have infinite resources and you never can put yourself in that place? Like, you know that you work best under deadlines. That's when you hit the wall and you've got something really great every single time, but you never get there because you don't have any kind of constraints on yourself.
Well, first of all, I would say congratulations, because I think you're unlike most people in this room. But in all seriousness, I mean, a lot of people do find themselves, they work for organizations that might be really resource rich, and they can have most things that they want. And I was just at a large tech company last month, and that's how things used to be for them for decades, basically, until this year, when the CFO said, actually, no, you're not getting a 10% increase in your budget. You're not getting an extra person. You've got to make do with what we had last year. So the danger, first of all, in that is it might seem like something good, but it actually makes it really hard to adapt, because my sense is inevitably you will find yourself in those situations of constraint. You might not find them now, but down the road you for sure will, because almost all of us face those type of constraints, and you lose that ability, that sharpness to be resourceful. So I think to get to the heart of your question is, how do you prevent that? And that's when you have to impose constraints on yourself. And this might seem a little counterintuitive and, dare I say, heretical to suggest, but you're working, go to your boss and say, give me one less person, or let me submit this project a week earlier, or give me a little less budget. I mean, most people would look at me like I'm crazy for recommending that. But what happens, you'll realize, is one, you can get the work done. Two, those constraints will put you into a mindset where not only can you get the work done, but you'll also get the work done better. And three, you'll teach yourself that you can cope and adapt and even thrive in those inevitable times when down the road you will face constraints.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned that most companies overplan. Like, at least the company I work for, we plan a year in advance, 5 years in advance. We track it. Every month, every quarter. So, do you propose a new way of strategic planning that's successful? That's not like results in just wasted efforts or wasted resources.
Yeah. So the danger with going too far in the future is you end up making assumptions about a world that may, or in many cases, may not exist. And you trick yourself into believing that the reality that you lay out in your plan is, in fact, the reality. So in one set of research, a group of people were looking at this question of, well, can you get to the best answers without those types of plans? And they looked at what we call the speed versus accuracy trade-off. And the idea is that the more accurate you are with things, so the more you plan, the more you spend on that, the slower you go, and vice versa. But what they actually found was that the best organizations are those that are able to be quick and accurate. And what they do differently is, instead of looking so far into the future, they look into the present, and they think of their plan as a set of iterative experiments. So they try something out, they learn some things, they make some small changes, and then they try it again. And it's cycles and cycles of planning, small scale planning, like in the sense of like, what are we going to do right now, learning, and then doing it again and again and over again. And what they're doing is they're gaining rich insight into their present, and they can then use that present to shape how they think about the future. But because they're not looking so far out into the distant, they're keeping their eye on the ball on the present, and the present is always changing. So they're understanding what that looks like. Okay, thank you. Okay, maybe time for one last question, or not? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott.
This has been a Metro TV production.